Good afternoon and welcome to this next episode of Governance Dialogues, a program where we explore challenges in the world of corporate governance. My name is Elisa Cole and I'm the Managing Director of Governance Center, and I'll be joined today by Giovanni Strampelli, who we're extremely excited to have today to talk about corporate governance challenges in Italy. For those of you who've been following the program, you know that on these episodes, we either address emerging hot topics or country-specific examples, and we've had an opportunity to canvass a number of very interesting country examples, including Brazil, for example, in conversation with the head of the securities regulator, but also the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and most recently Germany, in conversation with Daniela Favoccia. And today it's my pleasure to have you, Giovanni, over on the show to talk about Italy, a country that is, I think, perhaps in general terms, thought to have a very traditional kind of concentrated governance model. And I know that some of the cases that you'd like to talk about today, but I think is also very interesting for our audience to hear about on the Generali and also the Telecom Italia proxy fights, they are perhaps shaking up these notions of traditional governance. And so we'll be talking a little bit about these specific cases, but also their broader ramifications for the Italian market. So Giovanni, welcome to the program. It's such a pleasure to have you join us from nearby Milan.
Thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for the invitation, also the opportunity to discuss such topics together, of course.
A pleasure to have you. And I think obviously your expertise is and in particular your latest research on corporate governance and investor stewardship are of high relevance to the topics that we'd like to explore today with you. But also you teach, I mean, just to for the benefit of our audience, to introduce you a little bit better, you're a professor of business law and director of a law PhD program at Bocconi University in Milan, and have as far as I remember, taught in different universities in Germany, but also at Oxford, and published quite widely on issues related to corporate governance, but also broader securities regulation issues such as high-frequency trading, market abuse, directors' independence, and other topics that we'll be hopefully diving in today. And for the first question, I guess what I would like to ask for the benefit of our audience, perhaps not all of them, excuse me, have had an exposure to the Italian corporate governance model. I'd like to ask you to take us through some of the particularities and perhaps particular points in the governance of Italian companies compared, for example, to their European peers, and particularly looking at the listed market. Could you tell us a little bit?
Yes, thank you. As you know, in Europe, company law and kind of capital markets law are harmonized to some extent because of the directives. But of course, some differences remains, and I think that the Italian corporate governance system has some particularities. First of all, maybe it could be interesting also for the international audience to know that Italian listed companies, but joint stock companies more in general, are given the possibility to choose among three different corporate governance systems. So the first one is the one-tier model, similar to that adopted in the UK, for example. Then we have the two-tier model, very similar to the German one, but with a significant difference, because in Germany, probably the distinctive feature of the two-tier board is that the supervisory board appoints the board of directors. This is the same also in Italy, but the supervisory board members are appointed both by shareholders and workers. So there are some workers representative in the supervisory board. This is not allowed in Italy. So the two-tier board in Italy is quite different from the German one. But of course, so far the so-called traditional model with the board of directors and an external control body, that is the statutory auditor boards, remain prevalent. That's the first peculiarity of the Italian corporate governance system. The second one probably is that, probably against the conventional wisdom, in Italy there are many rules, especially for listed companies, aimed at protecting but also empowering minority shareholders. For example, minority shareholders are given the right to to ask directors to call a meeting. That is quite important, but also to ask the directors to add some items on the board agenda, on the agenda of the meeting. But of course, there are also some other rules. For example, Italy was probably the first country in Europe to introduce a regime for related party transaction in order to limit potential agency costs and also to limit tunneling on the part of controlling shareholders. And of course, maybe we'll come back on this later. Another distinguishing feature is the slate voting system that is probably the most well-known feature of the Italian corporate governance system, also international level.
Yes. I will definitely be coming back on the slate voting in the both sort of proxy fights that we will be talking about. But one of the other points you alluded to it is, of course, significant concentration. I think in the latest Consob report, Consob being the Italian securities regulator, for those of you who don't know, the average shareholder concentration listed companies was around, I think, 48%. And due to the kind of low free float of many listed companies, Italy actually lags vis-a-vis, I suppose, its potential in terms of its inclusion in the EU MSCI investable indices. I think it's around 4% of that index is taken up by Italian companies, which arguably, and I'd be curious to hear your view on that, is a little bit low. And you probably also know that the OECD had released a report recently on the Italian capital market and corporate governance, where they basically proposed some flexible structures of voting rights, including notably supermajority requirements to address concerns among founders and long-term shareholders. They proposed other ideas as to how to, let's say, empower the free float in Italian listed companies. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Is that an interesting direction to explore, and what might be some of the mechanisms to do so? Yes.
Regarding the first part of your question, usually Italy is deemed to be a concentrated owners country. This is true because if we look also at the Consob report you mentioned, we see that the vast majority of Italian listed companies have a controlling shareholders. Of course, that's true. Also, the free float is quite limited if compared with other markets. I think that, for example, of course, the London Stock Exchange, Frankfurt Stock Exchange, but also Amsterdam and others are much more liquid than the Italian Stock Exchange. But probably the ownership patterns in Italy are much more complex than this, because, of course, we have this majority of controlled companies, but we have also a good number of companies without the controlling shareholders. To be clear, there are very few, I would say, true public companies where the ownership is completely dispersed. I think that there are 4 or 5, not more than these companies. But there is a good number of companies that I would call as semi-dispersed owners company, where we have a large part of the capital that is dispersed among many shareholders, mainly institutional investors and retail investors, but where there are also some relevant shareholders holding, I say, a 10% of the share capital. So, and this is quite important because this last category of companies represent about 1/3 of market capitalization. So it's true that if you look at numbers, controlled companies are prevalent, but if we look at the relevance in terms of capitalization of companies, many of the most important Italian companies are not controlled companies. So that's the full picture. No? So I would say that something is changing in the ownership of Italian listed companies. Regarding the second part of what we can do to increase listings, the number of listings, or also the free float, there is a lot of debate about, as you say, more flexible voting structure, of course. No? And in 2014, the Italian legislature introduced both multiple voting shares and time phase or loyalty shares. So in order to increase the free float and also to incentivize listings, probably multiple voting share are key, no? Because this share can be introduced only before the listing, so only before the IPO. But once the company is listed, can retain the multiple voting share. So, according to the Italian legislator, these tools should incentivize controlling shareholders to list their companies because using the multiple voting shares, they are able to retain the control of the company. And this is also something that deals with the charter competition, because we had some very important Italian companies, for example, Fiat Chrysler, Ferrari, Campari, that decide to move their seat to the Netherlands and to be listed. And that's probably one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons probably is the possibility to use the multiple voting shares that are much more, I would say, stronger in the Netherlands, because you can have also up to 10 votes for share. In Italy, you can have only up to 3 votes for share. So, but if the question is about the success of this tool, probably the answer should be negative, because so far there are only 3 Italian listed companies with multiple voting shares. So at the end of the day, they prove not so key to incentivize listing. Also, the number of companies using this tool is clear, only 3 out of about 240 listed companies. And basically, they are also relatively small companies.
It's interesting because it seems in that regard, the Italian market is a little bit, is quite a bit different from, the trends we see, particularly in other developed markets, particularly if you contrast with the US, where multiple voting shares are so widely used in tech companies that,
yes.
It got so extreme that Snapchat went public, as you know, with shares that had no voting at all. So it's interesting how these mechanisms, while they have been, as you say, made available to companies, that they've had sort of lukewarm, perhaps, or slow adoption. At the same time, I mean, I think as far as I recall, the loyalty shares is something that actually has picked up, at least in the articles of association of companies, maybe not in practice in terms of adoption. So perhaps some of these mechanisms are finding a faster, let's say, rate of adoption than others, right?
Yeah, that's interesting, because loyalty voting share apparently are more successful, because so far we have 64 companies having loyalty shares, so a good number, about 1/3 of the Italian listed companies, more or less. And that's interesting because, of course, loyalty share can be introduced also from already listed companies. So listed companies can choose to introduce loyalty shares. But if we look at the company what decide to introduce the loyalty share, we see that are mainly relatively small companies with a controlling shareholders. That's something strange, no? Because in the view of the Italian legislator, loyalty shares should be a tool to incentivize long-term investment on the part of institutional investors, minority shareholders. So the first thing that seems quite strange to me is that all the companies that introduce loyalty share have a controlling shareholders. But if you look at the register, because you have to enroll in a register and you have to hold the shares for 2 years, and then after 2 years you receive double voting. You can see that the only shareholders who register usually is the controlling shareholder. There are no institutional investors. There are some very minor retail investors with very, very few shares. And it's interesting to see that at the end of the day, the goal of the loyalty share, in theory, is empowering the minority shareholders. But what actually happened in Italy is that loyalty share reinforced the controlling shareholders, because by receiving the double votes for their share, basically now they have the possibility to control not only the ordinary shareholder meeting, but also the extraordinary shareholder meeting. So to basically have a stronger control over the company. That's what really happened in Italy with loyalty shares.
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting to see how the let's say the different corporate governance parameters or rubrics that regulators play with globally have such different impacts in different jurisdictions. In some places it's really sort of meant to foster this sort of long-term investment perspective, and it's somewhat been successful. I think Portugal also had them. A few other places have adopted them, and I had a conversation with I think a couple of months ago on the Portuguese situation. But it seems that it's not necessarily working out from what you're saying in the way that the regulator would have intentioned it for now, and it's actually creating a greater concentration in the market. What's also interesting is that on the other hand, and you mentioned, you referred to institutional investors and their role in the market. That role is relatively, it seems to me, more, let's say, limited as compared to other European markets that you were referring to, obviously UK, but also others. And I think if I have the numbers right, I think only around 7% of Italian institutional investor portfolio are invested in local bonds and shares, which is extremely low. Like if I think of sort of jurisdictions where is the case, I'm thinking sort of emerging markets, maybe Egypt or something that's sort of very far away from the Italian situation. And on the other hand, we do see that their portfolios are obviously invested in stock markets to the tune of, I think, about $190 billion of equity investments abroad. So there is capital to mobilize. And I wonder if you could say something around this quite peculiar also situation, and in particular, the role of Assogestioni and the stewardship principles, and how perhaps the Assogestioni is trying to perhaps mobilize this interest in governance and, frankly, in investment locally. Sorry for this long-winded question.
Thanks, it's very clear. I think that also in this, regarding this, the role of institutional investors, maybe things are changing quite fastly in Italy, because in my opinion, institutional investors are playing a quite relevant role, both, I would say, in controlled companies, but also in non-controlled companies, mainly, of course, because in controlled companies, as also thanks to the slate voting system, probably they can do something for having better governance, because they can appoint directors, usually with some experience, so they can really bring some expertise in the board. But if you look at companies without controlling shareholders, for example, Generali, to give you a recent, to recall a recent example, but we can see that really institutional investors can play a role very similar to the role that they can play in the US, for example, because they own the majority of the share capital, and so that's quite tricky. Depends on the company you look at, but. Turning to Assogestioni, of course, Assogestioni is the association representing institutional investors, both Italian and international, operating in Italy. They have about, I think, 50 associates, so quite successful association. And Assogestioni play an interesting role because Assogestioni promotes, I would say, a rather unique model of collective engagement. There are other models. Also in the UK, there is the Investor Forum, or in the Netherlands, there is a U-Medium that promotes something similar, but probably what Assogestioni does is unique because we have a unique rule like the slate voting system. So what usually happens in Italy is that the majority shareholders, or the controlling shareholders, or the board in dispersed ownership companies submit a long slate to appoint the majority of the board, and the institutional investors submit a short slate and appointing the minority of the board, of course. Mm-hmm. And usually this minority slate is submitted by institutional investors under the coordination of Assogestioni, to be precise, under the coordination of Investor Managers Committee hosted by Assogestioni. That's interesting in several respects. First of all, I think it is a unique model of collective engagement. It's quite effective in overcoming potential collective action problem, also in favoring the sharing of costs, because of course to select candidate to submit the list comes with cost, but the system is able to share cost among different investors. But what is interesting is also that if you look at the investors who submit the list, you can see that they are usually mainly Italian investors that represent a small percentage of the share capital. Basically, the percentage that is necessary to submit the list because there is a minimum ownership threshold. But this list after gained the support of a large group of institutional investors. Basically, sometimes the short list submitted by institutional investors coordinated by Assogestioni tends to be the most voted list, more than the list submitted by the controlling shareholders, no? Because where you have the controlling shareholders that hold about 30% of their share capital, it may be the case that the short list is the most voted, no? That happened sometimes in the past. So I think that the role played by Assogestioni is really important, and also Assogestioni also promoted the Italian Stewardship Code in 2015. And the Stewardship Code, I think that it was quite important to promote engagement, basically, not to establish some good engagement practices, I would say, on how to escalate the engagement initiatives, on how to disclose engagement initiatives, on how to communicate with the company also in order to avoid market abuse regulation infringement, for example. So I think that the stewardship code was quite important, and maybe now it's also a time to revisit it a little bit. Now that's happened in the UK also, maybe to give more weight to the ESG issues that are gaining attention at the world level. So maybe it's time to revise it a little bit, but to be sure, I think that is something that will keep being important in Italy, to be sure.
Yes, and it's actually very interesting from your remarks and the model in Italy where Assogestioni plays such a critical role in coordination of the voting actions. And in fact, when I think of the US, I think it's almost kind of a very, very different model where the securities regulator actually has more focus on, let's say, voting in concert provisions than on allowing this coordination to happen. So it's quite different in terms of the approach, no?
Maybe I can add maybe also for people from the US, because usually in the US the hedge fund that tend to appoint a minority shareholders or to submit a short slate. I would say that the approach of Assogestioni is completely different now, because Assogestioni represent mainstream investors, basically not activist investors. So the approach is less confrontational. Basically, it's a more collaborative approach, and that's what probably the distinctive feature of this kind. We can call it activism, but probably it's not an activism.
Coordination. Well, it's interesting also because we had an interview on the program around some of the campaigns where the smaller funds are now collaborating with the large funds. If you remember the case of CalPERS and the recent action around, I think it was Shell.
Yes.
And that was also in collaboration with a smaller, more kind of activist, let's say, investor. So there are also some interesting collaboration, unorthodox collaborations in the US. But of course, I hear you that in Italy it's a slightly more, let's say, mainstream investor approach. But on that front, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the drivers that are changing kind of on the governance sustainability front? From an institutional investor perspective, how are things? Is it purely Assogestioni that's sort of moving the bandwagon, so to speak, or are there other external factors, whether we think about the shareholder rights directive or other sort of, let's say, learnings from other jurisdictions? What is driving the community, the institutional investor community here?
Yes, as you mentioned, the shareholder right directives 1 and 2, I think that they were key in Italy, at least, because only after the introduction of the shareholder right directive number 1, things changed significantly, because one of the new rules included in the shareholder right directive number 1 is the so-called record date. That is a very technical rule regarding how how to select shareholders that can vote, no? Because before the shareholder right directive, voting was quite difficult for institutional investors because they were required to mobilize their share for some days at the shareholder meeting. That was obviously a great problem. This problem was has been overcome by the shareholder right directive through the record date. So the record date was key because after the introduction of the record date, the attendance rate of institutional investors increased dramatically. So that's why the institutional investors also gain such a great importance, because the number of institutional investors attending increased so much. So that's why they are also able to be pivotal for the meeting outcome, no? Because now they I don't remember exactly the number, but in a good number, I would say 1/3 of FTSE MIB company shareholder institutional investors usually represent the majority of vote cast at the shareholder meeting. That's is a consequence of the record date. It seems, I would say, a very technical minor rule. Yeah. Is key to change the framework in Italy. Of course, another quite important rule was that introduced by the shareholder directive number 2, because now institutional investors at the European level are required to disclose their engagement policy and also to disclose every year how they apply this policy. So in terms of votes, in terms of engagements, and that's quite important. Of course, this is on a compliance-paying basis. There is not an obligation to engage or to vote, but of course, this disclosure provides a good incentive to be active, I would say. So at least this is what the legislator hopes. And I think that it's working, because also this kind of disclosure, I think that improve the quality of engagement, also the number of engagement, and help making institutional investors more active at the end of the day, I would say.
It's fascinating, actually, that there are small, what you say is sometimes I always say when I help, we also write corporate governance codes and other regulations for emerging markets. And I always say the devil is in the details, how sometimes these very small, seemingly minute provisions can actually engender kind of a sea of change. And speaking of that sea of change, I kept the last for the best, and that is obviously, Giovanni, the question on the Generali proxy fight, in which I know you've also published and followed very closely. And maybe you'd also like to say a few words about the Telecom Italia case, but the Generali one is actually, in a way, brings all of this conversation in one sort of space, in the sense that we have the slate voting system, the institutional investor situation, and even the semi-dispersed corporate ownership that you referred to earlier. So if you can talk to sort of walk us through what happened in Generali, and perhaps what is the significance of this of the outcome for the broader market.
Yes, Generali, I've seen that gain a great deal of attention, probably because Generali is one of the European leading insurers, but also one of the major Italian financial companies. But it was also an interesting case because it was relatively new for the problem that posed, no? Because what happened in Generali basically was that at the last general meeting, we had a clash between two slates. Basically between three slates. There was the slate submitted by the board, the slate submitted by relevant shareholder holding about 10% of the share capital, and then we had also the short slate submitted by institutional investors coordinated by Assogestioni. But also based on the guidelines adopted by leading proxy advisors or leading institutional investors, usually when you have a fight between two long slates, usually votes go toward one of these two slates. So in this case, the short slate submitted by institutional investors didn't receive much support, but because this is an international practice. No? So the showdown was between the slate submitted by the board and the slate submitted by these relevant shareholders. This is an interesting case because Generali is one of the, I would say, semi-dispersed ownership company I mentioned before, because Generali the ownership is generally quite dispersed, but there are some relevant shareholders. One of them submitted the slate. So in a case like this, and also the Telecom Italia case where we had a similar ownership, because we had I would say majority shareholders that Vivendi, that is a French media company that had about 25% of the share capital. Then we had the famous activist Elliott Fund that had about 9% of the share capital. So also in this case, what happened was that the slate voting system, according to the legislator, is something that is aimed at protected, empower minorities, so granting them the possibility to appoint at least a director. But when you have such a different ownership pattern, maybe the slate voting system becomes a tool that you can use to gain the control of the company. Because if you, in the case of Telecom Italia, Elliott, holding 9% of the companies, gained the support of quite a good number of other shareholders and institutional investors, and having just 9% of the share capital appointed the majority of the board. So in this sense, the Generali case is quite similar. The major difference between these two cases is that in the Telecom Italia, the clash was between two slates presented by two shareholders. In Generali, the clash was between the list submitted by the board and the list submitted by the shareholders. So among practitioners and Italian scholars, there is, because it's still ongoing, there is a quite fierce debate on whether the board can submit the slate, and the answer, I think, that is yes, because there is not a ban in the law. And the second question is whether the board should submit a slate when there are shareholders that decide to submit a slate, of course. As I wrote in a short piece that published in a CGI blog, in this context, of course, no matter if the slates are submitted by the board or the shareholders, what is key to prevail is to gain the support of institutional investors. No? Because if you, in this case, as the Generali case demonstrates, the support of institutional investors is key to prevail. And probably the main question one should ask in a situation like that happened at Generali is whether the board has some advantage in gaining the institutional investor support, no? Because the board basically, to be sure, has an advantage because usually engage with the institutional investors. So if I would say that they have more relationship with institutional investors. The other issue is that usually the clash is not, of course, it's between the slates per se, because many investors look at the candidates, their CV, their experience, their diversity. That's of course important, but the competition is also among the growth plans that these slates tend to support or to develop. And also in this respect, probably the board may have some advantages because, of course, has direct access to the company information, and by definition, also because of the market abuse regulation, shareholders cannot have the same information. So that's probably something that can put the board in a more favorable position to attract the vote of the social investors.
And we'll share, by the way, of course, the article that you're referring to, the CGI article on the when we release the interview, because it actually goes in greater detail and makes some interesting arguments, particularly on the point that you were just making, where you feel that the board is in a kind of better position. And there would be obviously a debate on that, whether the board is in a better position to do so or institutional investors are. And there would be obviously a healthy debate on that. But just to close our discussion today, I just want to ask you, Giovanni, so do you think that these two, let's say, incidents or precedents pave a way for a broader trend that we will see materialize more frequently in the Italian listed world, or are these sort of two roadside incidents?
No, I think that something that I would say that is not not exactly an insight, maybe a new experience that we had. I think that, of course, that will be not possible in the company with the controlling shareholders by definition. But I think that there are some important companies where something similar can happen. But I think that probably the most important lesson we learned from Generali or Telecom case that against the usual opinion that Italy is very concentrated on its country where institutional investors are not so important. I think that these two cases clearly demonstrate that the market force can play a major role also in Italy. I think that's something important also to attract new foreign investors, no? Because maybe this shows that the Italian market is relatively small, probably with concentrated ownership on average, but there are many important companies where the market can say an important word, I would say.
Interesting. And I think it would be great to leave our audience with that sort of positive thought as to where the market is going and where it's evolving. And I'm sure well, I know I have many other questions I would have liked to explore, but just in the interest of time, probably it would be, we'll have to wrap it up here. But thank you again for your time and your wisdom on these issues, in particular, these two latest company developments, which I think I agree with you, will pave a way to something, perhaps an evolution, I would say, of the Italian corporate governance system. So thank you, Giovanni, for joining us from Milan. And we hope that we'll have other occasions to talk about Italian corporate governance and with new developments in the market in the coming months.
I hope so. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.